The stars had forgotten the name of Earth, and the galaxy had moved on from the memory of mankind. 300 years had passed, since the Vethkai Dominion burned the blue planet to ash and glass, since their warships hunted down every colony and turned human cities into craters that glowed orange in the endless night of space. The Galactic Concord, that grand assembly of 1,000 alien species, had watched it happen and done nothing at all. They called it unfortunate, but necessary. A correction of the cosmic order, a lesson for young species who grew too fast and dreamed too loud. Humanity had been too ambitious, they said, too hungry, too unwilling to know their place among the elder races. And so when the Vethkai proposed their solution, the Concord looked away and let the killing begin. The war lasted only 18 months. But in that time 7 billion humans died on Earth alone, and billions more perished across the colonies that had spread like seeds through nearby star systems. The Vethkai were thorough and patient hunters who took pride in their work, and they chased refugee ships through the void for years after the main war ended, destroying them one by one until the silence of human extinction seemed complete, or so they believed. In the final desperate days of the war, when Earth was already burning and hope seemed like a cruel joke, a secret plan was put into motion by the survivors. 12 massive ships, each one carrying 50,000 souls, powered down every system that could be detected and went dark. They called themselves the Silent Ships, and they fled not toward any known destination, but into the spaces between stars, where no sane species would travel. The hollow reaches, the ancient maps called this region, a vast emptiness where the light of distant suns barely reached and where sensors found nothing. But cold and dark. The Vethkai searched for years but found nothing, and eventually they declared their mission complete. Humanity was extinct, they announced to the Concord, and the galaxy could rest easy knowing that the noisy young species would trouble them no more. The celebration lasted for days on Vethkai Prime, but deep in the hollow reaches, 12 ships drifted in perfect silence, and aboard them the last of humanity held their breath and waited. Commander Yuki Tanaka stood on the bridge of the Ark ship Perseverance and watched the darkness through the observation window, her reflection ghostly against the stars that seemed so far away. She was only 32 years old when the exodus began, a junior officer who had never expected to lead anything larger than a patrol squadron. Now she commanded the lives of 50,000 people who looked to her for hope in a universe that wanted them dead. The first years were the hardest, she would later tell her children, because they had to learn how to live in silence. Every transmission could be detected, every heat signature tracked, every quantum communication intercepted by Vethkai hunters who might still be searching. So the Silence ships learned to speak only to each other through tight beam lasers that could not be seen from more than a few thousand kilometers away. And they learned to recycle everything down to the last molecule of water and breath of air. Children born in those early years grew up never knowing the sound of rain or the feel of wind on their faces, never seeing a blue sky or green grass or any of the things their parents remembered. From the world that was gone, they called these children the first hushed, and they were strange and serious and full of a quiet determination that sometimes frightened their elders. We will go back, the children would say with certainty that seemed too large for their small voices, and we will make them remember us. Commander Tanaka watched these children grow and saw something new taking shape in them, something that had never existed in humanity before. They were patient in a way humans had never been patient, willing to wait years or decades or centuries for the right moment to act. They were united in a way humans had never been united, bound together by shared loss and shared purpose, until the old divisions of nation and culture and belief seemed meaningless, and they were angry. But their anger was not hot and wild like the anger of their ancestors. It was cold and deep and patient, an anger that could wait forever if it had to. The doctrine of patience became their creed, spoken in whispers by parents to children and passed down to the generations. Like a sacred promise, silence is not defeat, they would say, and silence is not death. Silence is preparation. And so humanity prepared in the darkness between the stars, turning their ark ships into laboratories and factories and schools where the greatest minds of the species worked to solve problems that the Concord had declared impossible. They studied the human body, and found ways to make it stronger and longer lived, until a human could expect to see to 100 years and remain healthy and sharp until the end. They studied the nature of space itself and learned to fold it like paper, to step from one point to another without crossing the distance between. They studied weapons and shields and tactics, not to conquer but to ensure that when they returned, no force in the galaxy could push them into silence again. 50 years passed, then 100, then 200, and the silent ships grew and changed until they barely resembled the desperate refugee vessels that had fled into the dark. Commander Tanaka lived to see her grandchildren born and her great-grandchildren take their first steps on the deck of the Perseverance. She was 187 years old when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, and her last words to her daughter were the same words she had spoken to every generation. Remember what they took from us, she whispered, and remember what we are becoming when the silence finally breaks. We will show them what patience has made. Her daughter, now Commander Maya Tanaka, held her mother's hand and made the promise that every leader of the hushed had made before her. We remember, she said, and we will never forget. The stars continued to turn in their ancient dance, and the galaxy continued to believe that humanity was nothing but a memory and a warning. But in the hollow reaches, 12 ships waited in perfect silence, and aboard them a new kind of human was preparing to remind the universe that some things do not die so easily. They were the hushed, and their patience was nearly at an end. Commander Maya Tanaka walked through the corridors of the Perseverance and watched her people work in the blue glow of screens and the soft hum of machines that had kept them alive for 3 centuries. She was the 4th commander of this ship, the great-granddaughter of the woman who had led them into the dark, and she carried the weight of that legacy in every step she took. The ship had changed so much since those early desperate days when her ancestors had fled the burning colonies with nothing but hope and fear. What had once been a crowded refugee vessel packed with frightened survivors was now a city in space, a home for 50,000 souls who had never known any other life. Children ran through the lower decks laughing and playing games that their great-great-grandparents would not have recognized, games that taught them to think in patterns and work together and solve problems that seemed impossible. These were the 5th hushed, born 300 years after the Exodus, and they were as different from the humans of old Earth as wolves were different from the dogs that humans had once kept as pets. Maya stopped at a viewing window and looked out at the darkness that surrounded them, that endless black that had been their protection and their prison for so long. Somewhere out there, beyond the hollow reaches, the galaxy continued to spin, and the Vethkai continued to rule their corner of space. With an iron fist, they probably never thought about humanity anymore. She realized, probably never wondered if anyone had survived their great hunt. We were just a problem they solved, she thought, just a mess they cleaned up and forgot about. But we remember everything. She continued her walk through the ship, past the laboratories where scientists worked on projects that would have seemed like magic to the humans of 3 centuries ago. Dr. Chenwei looked up from his console and nodded at her with the respect that all the hushed showed their commander, a respect earned not demanded. How goes the Neural Link project? Maya asked, and Chen smiled, the small satisfied smile of a man who had just solved a puzzle that had troubled him for years. We have achieved full synchronization, he said, and his voice carried the quiet pride of someone who knew they had changed everything. 16 pilots, 16 ships, one mind. Maya felt her heart beat faster at those words because she knew what they meant for the future that was coming. For decades, the hushed had worked on the problem of coordination, trying to find ways to make their small fleet fight as one perfect unit against the vast armadas of the Concord. The answer had come from an unexpected place, from the neural implants that allowed the hushed to share information and emotions with each other in ways that old humanity would have found terrifying. If 16 people could think together, they realized, then 16 ships could move together, react together, fight together as if they were one vessel with one mind. It was beautiful and strange and slightly frightening, and it was exactly what they needed. Maya thanked Dr. Chen and continued her walk past the schools where children learned the history of their people and the wrongs that had been done to Then she stopped outside a classroom and listened to a teacher named Old Thomas speak to a group of young ones with wide eyes and serious faces. They burned our cities, Thomas said in his gentle voice that somehow made the horror easier to hear. And they killed our families and friends and everyone we loved. They thought we would die in the dark, that we would fade away and be forgotten, but we did not die. Did we know? The children answered in perfect unison. We became something new, and what did we become? Thomas asked. We became the hushed, the children said. And we became patient. Maya smiled at the old ritual that every child learned before they could read or write, the words that bound them together across generations. Thomas noticed her standing in the doorway and gave her a small nod before continuing his lesson. Some of you may wonder why we wait so long, he said to the children. Why we do not simply find a new home far from those who hurt us and start again. A young girl raised her hand, no more than 7 years old, with dark hair and bright, curious eyes. My mother says we hide because we are weak, the girl said, and Thomas shook his head slowly. Your mother is testing you, little one, he said kindly, because she knows the true answer as well as anyone. We hide not because we are weak, but because when we return there will be no second war. There will only be the last. Maya felt the old familiar fire burning in her chest, the cold, patient anger that every hushed carried like a gift from their ancestors. She had been that little girl once, asking the same questions and receiving the same answers. Now she was the one who would decide. When the silence finally ended, she walked on, past the medical bays where doctors used techniques unknown to the rest of the galaxy to heal wounds and extend lives, past the engineering decks where mechanics maintained the systems that kept them alive, in the void, past the farms where workers grew food in tanks of nutrient water under artificial lights that mimicked the sun of a world none of them had ever seen. Every one of them knew their role and performed it perfectly, not because they were forced, but because they understood that their survival depended on everyone doing their part. This was what 3 centuries of silence had created. Maya realized a people who worked together like the cells of a single body. The old humanity had been brilliant, but divided, always fighting among themselves over resources and beliefs and power. The hushed had no such divisions because they could not afford them, because the darkness outside their ships was always waiting to swallow them if they faltered. Maya reached her destination at last, a small room at the heart of the ship where the Council of Elders met to discuss the future. 12 faces looked up at her as she entered, one representative from each of the 12 Ark ships that had survived the long night. We have received the latest reports, said Elder Kowalski of the Ark ship Endurance, his voice rough with age but still strong. The Vethkai remain dominant in their sector, but their alliance with the Concord has weakened over the centuries. There are cracks in their empire that did not exist before. Maya took her seat at the head of the table and looked at each of the elders in turn, reading the question in their eyes that none of them dared to speak aloud. You want to know if it is time, she said, and they nodded slowly. I have asked myself the same question every day since I took command. She was silent for a long moment, thinking of her mother and grandmother and great-grandmother who had all asked the same question and decided to wait, but something felt different now, a stirring in her blood that she could not explain. Soon, she said at last, and the word hung in the air like a promise. Soon the silence will break, and when it does the galaxy will learn what patience has made of us. The elders looked at each other with expressions that mixed fear and hope and something that might have been joy. After 300 years, the waiting was almost over, and humanity was ready to remind the universe that they were still alive. Sullivan was a trader of the Kethri people, a small insectoid species known throughout the galaxy for their curiosity and their willingness to travel where others feared to go. He had spent 40 years flying the edges of mapped space, looking for salvage and secrets that he could sell to the highest bidder. It was a dangerous life, but a profitable one, and Sullivan had grown rich by taking risks that other traders considered foolish. But even he knew better than to enter the hollow reaches, that vast empty region where the stars seemed to disappear and sensors found nothing but cold and dark. At least he thought he knew better until his ship detected something that should not have existed. A heat bloom, small but unmistakable, pulsing in the void like a heartbeat. Sullivan stared at his screens for a long time, his compound eyes reflecting the strange signal that his instruments insisted was real. Nothing lived in the hollow reaches. Nothing could survive in that emptiness between the stars, and yet there it was. Warm and alive and waiting to be found, his better judgment told him to turn around and forget what he had seen, to return to civilized space and pretend the anomaly had never appeared on his sensors. But curiosity had always been his greatest weakness and his greatest strength. He changed course and flew toward the signal, his small ship crossing into the darkness that had swallowed so many explorers. Before him days passed as he traveled deeper into the void, following the heat bloom as it grew stronger and clearer on his screens, and then he saw them ships, massive beyond anything he had ever imagined, hanging in the darkness like sleeping giants, 12 of them, each 1 kilometers long and covered in technology that made his instruments scream with confusion. They were beautiful and terrifying, and Sullivan knew with sudden cold certainty that he had made a terrible mistake. His ship lurched as something grabbed it, an invisible force that pulled him toward the nearest of the great vessels. He tried to escape, but his engines might as well have been toys for all the good they did against that grip. Within minutes he was inside a landing bay larger than most space stations, surrounded by lights and sounds and movement that overwhelmed his senses. Figures approached his ship, bipedal creatures in dark uniforms who moved with a fluid grace that seemed almost predatory. Humans. Sullivan realized with horror, and his heart nearly stopped beating in his chest. But humans were extinct. Everyone knew that. The Vethkai had killed them all 3 centuries ago, yet here they were, alive and watching him with eyes that held no fear and no hatred, only a calm curiosity that somehow frightened him more than anger would have. They brought him out of his ship gently, treating him with care that surprised him given all the stories he had heard about human violence. A woman approached him, tall and dark-haired, with the bearing of someone who commanded great power. "Welcome to the Perseverance," she said in perfect Kethri, her accent flawless in a way that should have been impossible for a species dead. "For 300 years I am Commander Maya Tanaka, and you have found something that was meant to stay hidden." Sullivan tried to speak, but his voice would not come, his mind still struggling to accept what his eyes were showing him. "You are wondering how we survived," Maya said with a small smile that held no warmth. "And you are wondering what we will do with you now. Both are reasonable questions." She gestured for him to follow, and he obeyed because he could not think of what else to do, his legs carrying him through corridors filled with humans who watched him pass with expressions he could not read. They brought him to a room with a table and chairs and food that looked strange but smelled wonderful, and they sat him down and fed him while Maya explained what had happened to her people. She told him about the silent ships and the exodus into the dark, about the centuries of hiding and growing and becoming something new. She told him about the technology they had developed and the changes they had made to themselves, about the cold, patient anger that drove them forward. And she told him what they wanted, what they had been waiting 300 years to do. "We could kill you," she said calmly when she had finished, "and no one would ever know you had been here, but that is not our way. Not anymore. Instead, we offer you a choice." Sullivan listened as she explained what she wanted from him. A simple task that would change the galaxy forever. He could return to civilized space with a message for the Galactic Concord, a warning and an ultimatum from a species that should have been dead, or he could stay here as their guest, comfortable but confined, until events played out without his involvement. It was not really a choice at all, and they both knew it. 3 weeks later, Sullivan's ship emerged from the hollow reaches and made its way to the capital world of the Galactic Concord. He requested an audience with the High Assembly, the gathering of representatives from every major species in known space. They granted his request because Kethri traders often brought valuable information from the edges of civilization, and they were curious what he had found. The assembly hall fell silent as Sullivan walked to the center of the great circular chamber, a small insectoid figure surrounded by thousands of alien faces. "I bring a message," he said in a voice that trembled despite his best efforts to control it. "From a species you believed extinct." Murmurs rippled through the crowd as he held up the device the humans had given him, a small crystal that glowed with soft blue light. He placed it on the podium and stepped back, and the holographic image of Commander Maya Tanaka appeared before the assembled leaders of the galaxy. She looked at them with eyes that held 3 centuries of cold fury, and when she spoke, her voice filled the chamber like thunder. To the architects of our extinction, she said, "We remember what you took from us. We have counted every death, every burning colony, every child who never saw sunlight. You believed silence meant death, and you were wrong. Silence meant patience, and patience has made us into something new. We are coming home, not for vengeance, because vengeance is small. We are coming for justice. You have 1 cycle to surrender the HFY War Council for trial before the courts we will establish. There will not be a second offer." The hologram faded, and for a long moment the assembly hall was completely silent. Then the HFY ambassador rose from his seat, his scaled face twisted with contempt and fury. "This is a trick," he snarled, "a deception created by cowards and fools. Humanity is dead, and no ghost story will change that fact." The other ambassadors nodded and muttered their agreement, dismissing the message as impossible, but Sullivan saw the fear in their eyes, the tiny seed of doubt that the human commander had planted, and he knew, with the certainty of someone who had looked into the face of the impossible, that the galaxy was about to change forever. The silence was breaking, and nothing would ever be the same again. The HFY did not believe, and why would they believe when everything they knew told them that humanity was dead and gone? Their warships gathered above their homeworld in the greatest display of military power the galaxy had seen in 500 years. 10,000 vessels armed with weapons that had burned Earth to glass and hunted humans through the stars. Admiral Ketharas stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Flame, and watched his fleet take formation. With pride swelling in his chest, "Let them come," he said to his officers, with contempt dripping from every word. "Let these ghosts emerge from their hiding place, and we will finish what we started 3 centuries ago." His officers cheered and stamped their feet in the old warrior salute of their people, certain that victory was already theirs. The deadline passed with no sign of the mythical human fleet, and the HFY laughed at the empty threat. "Cowards," Admiral Ketharas declared to the watching galaxy. "Nothing but cowards who fled into the dark and now play games with shadows and lies." He had barely finished speaking when the first ship appeared. It emerged from folded space, directly above the planetary North Pole. Impossibly close, impossibly large, hanging in the sky like a new moon made of metal and light. Then another appeared over the South Pole, and another over the Great Ocean, and another over the capital city itself. 12 ships in all, arranged in a perfect sphere around HFY Prime, each one positioned with mathematical precision that should have been impossible for separate vessels to achieve. Admiral Ketharas stared at the holographic display showing the alien ships and felt the first cold touch of fear. In his hearts they were enormous, far larger than any vessel he had ever seen, and they gleamed with technology that his sensors could not identify or explain. How did they get so close? He demanded of his officers, and no one had an answer. Their approach had been invisible, undetectable, as if they had simply materialized from nothing. "Attack," the admiral ordered, and 10,000 warships turned their weapons on the intruders. The battle began with fire and fury, with missiles and energy beams and kinetic projectiles screaming through space toward the human vessels, and then the battle ended. 11 minutes after it had started, the HFY weapons never reached their targets, stopped by shields that bent light itself around the human ships like water flowing around stones. And then the humans responded, not with fire of their own, but with something far more terrifying. Admiral Ketharas watched in horror as his fleet simply stopped working, one ship after another going dark and silent as their systems shut down without warning. There were no explosions, no debris fields, no screaming communications from dying crews. The ships just stopped, hanging motionless in space like toys abandoned by children on the bridge of the Eternal Flame. The lights flickered and died, replaced by a soft blue glow that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. A calm voice filled the air, speaking in perfect HFY with an accent that no living member of his species would recognize. Admiral Ketharas. The voice said, "Your fleet has been disabled and your crews have been sedated for their own safety. They will wake in 6 hours with nothing worse than headaches. You have failed to surrender the war Council has requested. We will now take them ourselves." The admiral tried to move, tried to reach for his sidearm, tried to do anything at all, But his body would not obey. A sweet smell filled his nostrils, and darkness crept into the edges of his vision. And the last thing he saw before consciousness fled was a human face appearing on his view screen. The woman was smiling, but it was not the smile of triumph that he expected. It was the smile of someone who had already won, who had won 300 years ago when they chose to survive and wait and become something new. On the surface of Vethkai Prime, the population watched their invincible armada fall silent and drift, and they knew that the universe had changed forever. Human landing craft descended through the atmosphere, small and sleek and utterly silent, touching down in the great plaza before the Hall of Conquest, where the War Council met. Soldiers emerged in armor that seemed to drink the light, moving with perfect coordination that made them look like parts of a single machine. Rather than individual beings, they did not fire their weapons, did not need to, because the planetary defenses had been neutralized from orbit. With the same impossible technology that had disabled the fleet, the War Council tried to flee, but found their escape routes blocked, tried to fight, but found their guards unconscious and their weapons useless. Within an hour, they were in human custody. 6 old Vethkai who had ordered the deaths of billions and never lost a moment of sleep over their choices. Commander Maya Tanaka walked through the halls of their greatest monument and felt nothing but cold satisfaction at what her people had accomplished. A communication request appeared on her neural display, and she accepted it to find Admiral Kethras looking at her with hatred and fear warring in his yellow eyes. "What are you?" he demanded, because nothing that had happened matched anything he understood about warfare or physics or the possible. "We are what you made us," Maya replied calmly. "We are what 300 years of silence and patience created. You tried to kill us all, and instead you forged us into something beyond what humanity was ever meant to become." The Admiral hissed with frustration, his claws scraping against the console of his disabled ship. "You cannot hold us," he said with desperate bravado. "The Concord will not allow this violation of galactic law." Maya laughed, and the sound held no joy at all. "The Concord watched you murder our children and burn our worlds," she said, "and they called it unfortunate, but necessary. We do not answer to the Concord anymore. We answer only to justice, and justice has waited 300 years for this day." She ended the communication and walked out of the Hall of Conquest into the alien sunlight of a world that had celebrated human extinction above her. The 12 arc ships hung in the sky like new stars, visible even in daylight through the sheer magnitude of their presence. The Vethkai citizens watched her emerge with expressions she could not read, fear and confusion, and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. "We are not here for vengeance," she said loudly enough for the recording drones to capture her words. "We are here for justice. Your War Council will stand trial for genocide, and they will answer for every life they took. But you, the people of this world, are not our enemies. We do not punish children for the sins of their leaders, and we do not seek to become the monsters you tried to make us." She turned and walked back to her landing craft, leaving the stunned population of Vethkai Prime to contemplate a future they had never imagined. The last war was over, and it had lasted less than a single hour. Humanity had returned, and they had won without becoming the destroyers their enemies had expected. That, more than anything else, was the victory that mattered. The trial was broadcast across every inhabited world in the galaxy, watched by trillions of beings who had believed humanity was nothing but a cautionary tale. They saw the 6 members of the Vethkai War Council standing in a courtroom, built on neutral ground, surrounded by human judges and representatives from species that had suffered under Vethkai aggression over the centuries. They heard testimony from human survivors whose families had been murdered, whose colonies had been burned, whose entire civilization had been sentenced to death by these 6 old creatures, who showed no remorse, and they watched as evidence was presented, recordings and documents and data that proved beyond any doubt that the extinction of humanity had been planned and executed with cold, deliberate precision. The galaxy learned the truth that the Concord had hidden for 300 years, that they had known what the Vethkai intended and had chosen to look away. Species that had considered humans dangerous and unpredictable saw something different now. A people who had suffered the worst crime imaginable and responded not with destruction, but with justice. The trial lasted 3 months, and when it ended, the verdict was unanimous. The 6 members of the War Council were found guilty of genocide, of crimes against sentient life, of atrocities that had no equal in recorded history, but the sentence was not death. And this surprised the watching galaxy more than anything else. You expected us to kill them, said the chief human judge as she delivered the verdict, because that is what you would have done and what they did to us, but we are not you, and we will not become the thing we fought against. The 6 council members were sentenced to carry the names of every human who had died because of their orders, encoded into their neural architecture so they could never forget. Every morning when they woke, and every night when they slept, they would hear the names of the dead. 7 billion from Earth and billions more from the colonies. They would carry this burden until their natural deaths, never allowed to escape the consequences of their choices. It was a punishment worse than execution, and everyone who watched understood why the Vethkai would have to live with what they had done, would have to know that their crimes would never be forgotten or forgiven. When the trial ended, Commander Maya Tanaka requested an audience with the Galactic Concord to address the assembly. That had allowed her people to burn. The request was granted because no one dared to refuse her now, not after what they had seen the human fleet accomplish in 11 minutes. She walked into the great chamber alone, a single human figure surrounded by thousands of alien faces that watched her with fear and fascination and something that might have been respect. The hall fell silent as she reached the central podium, and for a long moment she simply stood there, looking at the representatives of a galaxy that had abandoned her ancestors to death 300 years ago. She began in a voice that carried to every corner of the chamber. You watched us die and called it necessary. You let the Vethkai hunt our children through the stars, and told yourselves it was for the best. You believed that silence meant we were gone, that you would never have to answer for what you allowed to happen. She paused and looked around at the faces watching her, reading the guilt and fear that many of them could not hide. We have returned, she continued, not as conquerors seeking to build an empire on the graves of our enemies. We have no interest in your territories or your resources or your allegiances. We will take nothing. That is not ours, and we will force nothing on anyone who does not deserve our attention. A murmur rippled through the assembly as the implications of her words sank in. They had expected demands, expected humanity to use their superior technology to subjugate or destroy, because that was what any other species would have done. But Maya Tanaka was not finished. Let this be understood by every species in this chamber and every world watching this broadcast, she said with ice in her voice. Humanity remembers, and humanity endures. We have seen what happens when the galaxy looks away from genocide, and we will not allow it to happen again. The next time any species faces extinction at the hands of another, we will be watching, and we will not be silent. She turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at the assembly one final time. You feared us once because we were young and loud and ambitious, she said, and perhaps you were right to fear us then, but we are not that species anymore. We are something new, something that your cruelty created. We are patient, and we are united, and we have learned that true strength is not the power to destroy. True strength is the power to destroy and the wisdom to choose justice. Instead, she walked out of the chamber, and no one tried to stop her. The human delegation followed in perfect silence, leaving the representatives of 1,000 species to contemplate what they had witnessed. Outside the assembly hall, the sky was dark and filled with stars that seemed closer now than they ever had before, and there, hanging above the capital city like new moons made of metal and light, were the 12 arcships of the hushed. The people of the capital world, diplomats and politicians and ordinary citizens alike, came out of their buildings and looked up at the human vessels with wonder and fear. They saw lights moving behind the observation windows, figures walking and working and living in those enormous ships that had hidden in the darkness for 3 centuries, and then they noticed something that made them stop and stare, something that would be talked about for generations to come. The humans were standing at the windows, looking down at the world below them, and they were smiling, not with triumph or malice, or the cruel satisfaction of victors gloating over the defeated. They smiled with something that looked like peace, like people who had finally set down a burden they had carried for too long. They smiled like parents who had told their children a hard truth and were ready now to move forward. They smiled like survivors who had won, not by becoming monsters but by holding onto their humanity in the darkest of circumstances. The watching Aliens did not know what to make of those smiles, could not understand how a species that had suffered so much could look down at the galaxy with such calm contentment, but Commander Maya Tanaka understood. Standing at the observation window of the Perseverance with her officers beside her, we did it. She whispered to the memory of her mother and grandmother and great-grandmother, all the generations who had carried the dream of this moment without living to see it. We came back, and we showed them what we became. We showed them that the silence did not break us. It made us stronger than we ever knew we could be below her. The galaxy stretched out in all directions, vast and beautiful and forever changed by what humanity had accomplished. The silence was finally broken, and in its place was something new, hope, perhaps, or the beginning of a future that no one had dared to imagine, and above it all, humanity smiled, patient and united, and finally at peace. They had come home at last.